I buried my husband with an empty pew staring back at me like a question I couldn't answer. The church in our small Midwestern town felt too big that morning. Every wooden bench polished and waiting. Every hymn lifting into a ceiling that gave the sound back to me twice as lonely. I am Helen Carter, late 60s, and I stood beside Thomas's flag and the folded firefighter jacket he wore through winters that took roofs and summers that took breath. The honor guard did their part. The organ let the last note hang in the air until my bones remembered it. But the space where my son should have been, where Mark and his wife Brooke should have set their coats, and their pride down that space, hurt louder than the music. I watched neighbors step forward with the kind of kindness that doesn't need an introduction. Casserole people, snow shovel people, the ones who show up without asking where the thank you will come from. They carried us as far as they could, and then the doors shut, and I was left with the jacket's weight and the faint smell of smoke Thomas never quite washed out. It is a strange thing when a quiet life ends, and the loudest thing left is silence. It bruises. It leaves fingerprints in places no one can see. I walked through the reception like someone balancing a glass too full. I smiled because that is what you do when your whole life just changed and the rest of the world still needs napkins and directions to the coffee. People asked about Mark the way people ask about Weathersoft, apologetic, helpless. I gave answers that kept their eyes kind and their hands busy. Then the room emptied. Chairs tucked under tables, the flag boxed carefully. The jacket folded and refolded until the crease looked like a promise I couldn't keep. Grief teaches time in a new language. Mornings stretch and nights blink, and days stack where the mail lands. 3 weeks later, a certified envelope slid beneath that stack, with my name pressed in a hand I knew better than my own. The kind of envelope that makes a house hold its breath. I set it on the kitchen counter near Thomas's mug and let it wait until my hands stopped shaking. I didn't know it yet, but that letter would change what grief meant in this house. It would change what the word inheritance could say without money ever speaking first. I can tell you this much now. Showing up has a price, and so does not showing up. Before this is over, I will learn exactly what a son's apology is worth and what it can never buy. I thought the hardest part was lowering Thomas into the ground, but grief has a way of lingering in the quiet that follows. The days after the funeral settled into a strange rhythm. Neighbors arrived with casseroles, green bean, tuna, chicken and rice, each dish heavy enough to feed a family, though mine had shrunk to just me. I stacked them in the fridge, then the freezer, and finally gave up and let them clutter the counter. At night, the ticking of the kitchen clock grew louder, the hum of the refrigerator sharper. A house built for two had turned into a museum of small sounds. In a small Midwestern town, people notice absence as much as presence. At the grocery store, I felt the weight of their eyes, their questions disguised as kindness. Wasn't Mark able to make it home? Brooke must be so busy with the children. I gave the same rehearsed half-truth each time, a careful sentence polished until it no longer wobbled in my throat. I wasn't about to confess that the front pew had been empty because my own son had chosen convenience over duty. Instead, I smiled and said, "They'll come when they can," and people nodded, satisfied enough to let me bag my milk and bread in peace. It was on the third week, when the casseroles had grown stale and the silence had become unbearable, that a certified letter arrived. Heavy paper, a law office seal, Thomas's attorney. My hands shook as I slid it open. Inside was a trust, one I hadn't known existed. Not a simple bank account, not a windfall, but something more deliberate, more Thomas. His handwriting in the margins explained it best. Character determines access. The money itself was not the point. The principle was, he had built this safety net quietly, piece by piece, never boasting, never hinting, always saving for a day when values would be tested. My first reaction was anger, 40 years of marriage, and he had kept this from me. But just as quickly, gratitude softened the edges. This was Thomas in his truest form, a firefighter who believed in showing up, a man who planned not for applause, but for protection. He had given me a tool, not just for survival, but for discernment. The trust wasn't only about money, it was a mirror. Whoever came seeking it would see themselves in its conditions. I closed the letter and pressed it to my chest. Fury would be too easy, and entitlement would only grow in the soil of anger. If Mark and Brooke came to my door, I would meet them not with rage, but with reflection. Whatever they revealed, the mirror would show it back to them. And as if summoned by that thought, I heard the low rumble of Brooke's SUV pulling into the driveway. The first time Mark and Brooke crossed my threshold after the funeral, the air itself seemed to shift. Brooke carried her perfume ahead of her like a calling card, sweet, deliberate, the kind of scent that lingered long after she sat down. Mark followed with shoulders squared too carefully, as if posture could mask intent. They didn't ask to be seated. They simply arranged themselves as though the living room had been staged for their inspection. I watched their eyes move, not at me, but at the room. The photographs on the mantel, the clock Thomas wound every night at 9, the firefighter commendation folded in its case. Their gazes slid over each piece like appraisers at an estate sale, cataloging, tallying, weighing. Even Thomas's pocket watch on the bookshelf seemed to hold their attention longer than love should. That little brass timepiece, worn smooth from years in his hand, had no dollar value in my mind. But in theirs, I saw the arithmetic happening behind their polite nods. Their manners dressed up the moment. But I knew why they had come. It was not grief that drove them, but curiosity what had been left behind. What could be claimed? What part of Thomas's life could be converted into gain? I sat steady in my chair, letting their eyes finish their rounds, and then I drew the line. Any conversation about legacy, I told myself, would happen only in the light of Thomas's memory, not in the currency of assets, not in the shallow language of possession. If they could not honor him first, then they could not touch a single piece of what he built. After they left Brooke's perfume still clinging to the sofa cushions, Mark's careful posture leaving a shadow in the recliner, I returned to the letter. The trust papers were spread across my kitchen table, their legal phrasing dense and deliberate. That's when I noticed it, a sealed page, handwritten by Thomas, marked for my eyes only if Mark ever revealed money meant more than memory. My breath caught at the weight of that foresight. Even from the grave, Thomas had prepared for this exact moment. I called the attorney the next morning, my voice calm, my resolve firm. The page would not be opened lightly. It was a trigger, meant for a time when choices had already spoken louder than words. Knowing it existed raised the stakes. This was no longer about grief alone. It was about a test Thomas had set in motion, and whether our son was ready to face the mirror, it would hold up to him. At the attorney's office, I was reminded again of Thomas's steady hand. His trust was written with the kind of clarity only he possessed. The principle was simple, but demanding character before cash. Every line of those papers carried his quiet belief that money should amplify what is already present in a person, not cover up what is missing. I sat there, pen in hand, realizing the weight of the choice in front of me. I had the power to punish, to cut Mark out completely, to let anger decide. But anger was never Thomas's way. He fought fires to protect, not to destroy. And I knew my choice had to echo that. Teach, don't punish. That would be my path. The truth I kept from Mark but share with you is that Thomas left more than comfort. He left security on a scale I had never imagined. Not wild fortunes or flashy stocks, but millions, layered carefully over 4 decades of patient saving. Steady index funds, bonds tucked away, and 2 small rental homes in towns not far from ours. Nothing glamorous, everything solid. It was Thomas in financial form, practical, unassuming, reliable, enough to change lives. Yes, but only if handled with the same discipline that built it. So, I made a plan. If Mark wanted a role in this legacy, he would need to show that he could carry values, not just inherit numbers. I set the markers as Thomas would have honoring commitments without excuse, caring for family beyond convenience, proving he could hold steady work without complaint, and showing respect for money by saving rather than spending it bare. I would not hand him the mountain, but I would offer a stone, a modest snapshot of one small account. Enough to test his reaction. Would he see opportunity to grow, or entitlement to demand more? To stage the test, I turned to ritual. Sunday dinner, 6 o'clock sharp, at the old oak table that had carried every holiday before this one. I prepared Thomas's favorites pot roast with vegetables, warm dinner rolls, and an apple pie that filled the house with a sweetness almost like presents. I laid out the navy dress Thomas always loved, pressed it carefully, and set the table with deliberate calm. On the side, in a folder no thicker than a school report, waited the modest account statement, my quiet measure of intent. As the clock ticked toward 6, I felt the anticipation coil tight inside me. This was no longer about money at all. It was about whether my son would see love and memory at the table, or only the numbers hidden in a folder waiting at my side. Sunday dinner looked right, but it didn't feel right. The roast filled the house with the smell of thyme and onions. The rolls came out golden, and the apple pie cooled by the window, just as it had for decades. I wore the navy dress Thomas always liked, the one that made him say I looked steady, like home. Mark sat across from me, Brooke at his side, their plates filled, their forks moving. For a while, it was quiet in the way family dinners sometimes are, just the sound of utensils on china, the clink of glasses, the scrape of a chair leg. Then came the folder. Slim, unassuming, resting by my side until I slid it closer. Inside was only a modest account snapshot, a fraction of Thomas's careful work. I didn't speak about it. I just let it rest within reach, the way a teacher might leave a book on the edge of a desk. And I watched. I saw Mark's eyes flicker, linger, calculating, not wide with gratitude, not softened with memory. His eyes did math, and in that moment, the room felt colder. The gap between us widened, not with words, but with numbers that seemed louder than everything else. My chest tightened. The test had its answer, and it was not the one I had hoped for. The days after were silent. No calls, no knocks at the door, just me, the folded firefighter jacket, and the steady tick of Thomas's pocket watch in the empty house. I told myself to stay resolved. I told myself that Thomas's handwritten page might soon be needed, but part of me still waited, still hoped. It was 3 days later when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Mark stood at the door alone, shoulders softer this time, his hands empty. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he walked to the mantel where Thomas's photograph rested. He looked tired, older. Later, I learned he had gone to the cemetery, stood at Thomas's grave, and let himself finally weep. He had found the pocket watch there, left on the headstone by some unknown hand. When he held it in his palm, he said it felt less like a timepiece and more like a compass. And in his posture, I saw something different, not perfection, not a sudden fix, but surrender. I chose to believe it. I chose to see a second chance, because Thomas believed in teaching, not punishing, and I would do the same. Still, as I watched Mark close his hand around the watch, I felt it deep in my chest this chance would not go untested. Not for him, not for me. The year that followed wasn't marked by grand gestures or sweeping apologies. It was built on the smallest bricks of ordinary days. Mark moved back into his old room, the one with the baseball posters still curling at the corners. His alarm rang at 06:15 every morning, and I would hear the thud of his boots on the hallway floor as he left for the hardware store. Pay stubs began stacking neatly in a shoebox on his dresser, each one proof of hours traded for something steady. Evenings were filled with quieter acts. At 07:10 one night, I watched him crouched under the kitchen sink, fixing the faucet that had dripped for months without complaint. On Saturdays, he carried boxes at the food pantry, his name scribbled in volunteer logs that didn't ask for credit but gave it anyway. He cut the lawn without being asked, sat with me at doctor's appointments, and once chased down the neighbor's runaway dog at 18:30 sharp, returning with mud up to his knees and laughter I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't perfection, it was presence. And presence, I was learning again, was the truest form of love. But life doesn't let lessons rest untouched. Brooke returned, her stomach rounded with new life, and with her came a storm I hadn't braced for. She wanted custody of Emma, and suddenly our quiet routines were dragged into a courtroom's harsh light. The whispers in town followed us inside. People remembered Mark missing his father's funeral, and the gossip painted him as unreliable, unworthy. My chest burned with anger at how quickly absence can outweigh a year of showing up. Yet Mark stood different this time. He didn't argue or lash out. He laid his life on the table like open hands, pay stubs stacked in order, references from his boss at the hardware store, volunteer logs signed week after week. Even the neighbor who owned the runaway dog came to testify about the night Mark showed up unasked, muddy and grinning. Evidence of change was no longer a story I told myself. It was written in ink and witnessed in community. The judge's words were measured, not sweeping. Joint custody, structured visitation, enough to keep Emma's life balanced, enough to keep Brooke's fire from consuming the whole future. For some, it might have felt like a half win. For me, it was everything. In the parking lot afterward, I sat in the car and let the tears come. Not for the trust, not for the money waiting behind sealed envelopes, but because showing up had finally been seen and named. That night, when the house was quiet again, I pulled out Thomas's envelope from the drawer, the one marked, "When he's ready." My hands lingered on it, the paper soft with time. I held it close, but did not open it. Not yet. Readiness, I realized, isn't declared in a courtroom. It's lived. And I would wait one beat longer to see if Mark could carry what his father had left behind. The nursery was once Thomas's workshop. His tools used to line the walls, neat and orderly, each one in its place. Now, soft light from a night lamp painted the room in gold, and a rocking chair creaked gently as Mark read "Good Night Moon" to Emma. Her tiny hands reached toward the pictures, her breath steady against the rhythm of his voice. on the dresser nearby. Thomas's pocket watch ticked, steady as ever. Its sound softer than a heartbeat, but just as constant. I stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping in. It was the right moment. I carried a folder thicker than any I had shown before, and inside it rested Thomas's final letter along with the complete trust documents. I handed it to Mark, not as a reward, not as punishment, but as an invitation to step into the truth his father had been preparing for decades. Thomas's handwriting on the first page was firm, almost stubborn in its clarity. Wealth is not the surprise character is. I watched Mark read those words, his brow furrow, his shoulders lift as if bracing. Then came the numbers, over 2,000. Not in flash or gamble, but in the solid weight of index funds, savings accounts layered with patience, and 2 modest rental homes that had carried families when times were lean. Thomas had not left us a fortune to flaunt. He had left us a structure, most of it designated for a family foundation, his final act of service. It would cover utility bills for families on the brink, small rent gaps that keep children from moving mid-school year, car repairs for single parents trying to get to work, and scholarships for apprenticeships so hands could learn skills without being shackled by debt. The portion set aside for Mark came with guardrails, just as Thomas had intended. Monthly caps, budgets centered on service first, stewardship, not splurging, a design that would either amplify Mark's character or expose the lack of it. The pocket watch ticked on the dresser, and I thought how fitting it was wealth not as a clock running out, but as a compass pointing forward. For me, the real gift wasn't the 2,000 hours. It was the arc of change I had witnessed. From absence to presence. From silence to steady showing up. The money was just an echo of that deeper truth that boundaries, set in love, can be the very thing that saves us. And now, I want to leave you with this: showing up costs nothing, yet it's the most expensive thing we can give each other. It is the measure Thomas lived by, and the one I try to live by still. So, if you're listening, I'd like you to share where you're watching from in the comments. I want to be able to say your town's name out loud and mean it, because presence matters, whether it's across a table or across a screen. And if this story touched you, I ask you to like and share it. Not for me, but so the lesson Thomas left doesn't stop here. The last thing I saw before turning out the nursery light was Mark closing Thomas's pocket watch in his hand. Not a clock anymore, but a compass, and it pointed home.